Hello and welcome to the Sound on Sound recording and mixing podcast channel. I am Eddie Bazil. In this podcast, I'm going to demonstrate how to use various processors to add weight and color to drum beats. In days gone by, also known as the bad hair years, the roles of the engineer and producer were clearly defined. A studio engineer's job involved managing and maintaining all forms of hardware, operating and maintaining finger-slicing tape machines, routing and patching effects and dynamics, miking up sessions, making coffee, laughing at the singer's jokes, cleaning the studio, making more coffee, befriending the drummer, and conducting what we in the industry refer to as a level and pan mix. This entailed gain-staging the entire mix and panning sounds for correct spot pan placement, and to alleviate the problems associated with clashing, masking, and summing of frequencies. The producer, on the other hand, would walk in when the level and pan mix was completed and begin to color the mix creatively. Yes, the producer also had additional roles like managing and directing the artists, bringing in external musicians where needed, acting as the mediator between the label and studio, and so on. But the real aim of the producer was to color the mix creatively and optimize it for the genre it was aimed for. For this reason alone, we would often buy albums because we liked the style and creative input of a particular producer. Producers had their own followers. Nowadays, mix engineers or producers or beat makers or whatever is the politically correct and in-fashion tag to use have to manage almost all areas of the recording, mixing, mastering, delivering, and marketing processes. The role of the producer has changed dramatically. What hasn't changed is the creative aspect of production. This is what defines a producer's signature, the color associated with a production. For this reason alone, more and more producers are exploring sound design as a means to realize their creative aims. So let me share with you some techniques I use to color drum sounds and beats, and hopefully it will prompt the sound designer in you to share equal stage with your mixing self. In example 1, I use Wave's hybrid compressor to add clarity and bite to a staid drum beat. First, the dry version. And now the processed version. Wave's hybrid compressor is built as a dynamic processor that combines the modeled behavior of transformers, tubes, and transistors together with the power and precision that only a plugin can provide. Clearly, nothing new there. However, when used on drum sounds and beats, this compressor has a character that others struggle to emulate. Although it comes laden with all the usual functions you'd expect from a downward compressor, hybrid compressor adds 2 more features to help you shape sounds: analog and punch. Analog, at best, is pretty useless, but punch is a game changer. It takes away the need to apply additional processes like transient shaping and equalization on top of the compression to emulate punch. I opted for a generous threshold setting, -31.8 dB, to grab most of the drum beat, a late attack to allow transients to shine through, and a hefty 8:1 ratio to tighten the dynamic range. I timed the release to grab all the percussive elements within the beat, and then I added some fairy dust using the punch feature, which was set to 6.4. The kick bounces along thick, deep, and clear. The hi-hats come across as fizzy and bright, and the snare has more clarity and life. The result is punchy, yet clean. In the second example, I'm using Klanghelm's SDRR plugin to highlight all the individual drum elements whilst thickening and rounding the overall body of a drum beat. Here is the dry version. And now the processed version. Klanghelm's SDRR is one of those plugins that everyone must own. Klanghelm claim SDRR is more than a saturation tool, and I have to agree with that. The list of features is impressive. Saturation, equalization, compression, bit crushing, sample rate reduction, stereo widening, harmonic generation, and much more. These impressive functions are supplied across 4 saturation modes that are selected by the user: tube, digi, fuzz, and desk. To list all the mode features and how the various functions behave for each mode would take far too long. Suffice to say, this plugin is a beast. Whenever I use saturation plugins, I make sure to dial in hefty amounts of drive at the input stage. This allows me to hear the various saturation elements clear and pronounced in isolation. Once I'm happy with the overall saturation effect, I start to tame the input drive until I achieve the desired color. With this particular example, I'm using a drive input value of 6, which is quite generous and brave. I've opted for the digi mode and only adopted the following features. Drift at around 2 o'clock. This modulates the internal processing and is used to add motion to a sound. Frequency response, which I've steered towards high frequency. Frequency response governs how saturation affects the selected frequency response of the audio signal. Dynamics, which I have edged closer to slow, this controls the dynamic response of the selected saturation mode. By setting it to slow, the resultant sound comes across as thicker and fuller. Bit and rate, these govern bit crushing and sample rate reduction. I've opted for some bit crushing to dirty the overall saturation response. The beat comes across as fuller and more pronounced, and yet it has acres of dynamic motion with a crispy, airy texture. Example 3 demonstrates how a sound can be completely molded into a new, vibrant texture using the wonder that is FabFilter's Saturn II. Here is the dry version. And here is the processed version. Lauding FabFilter and their approach to developing professional plugins has fast become a hobby for many producers, and Saturn II is a testament to that. Saturn II is not just a distortion plugin, it is a sound designer's dream. I could write an article on how deep this plugin can venture, but to be honest, it is as fearsome when used as a simple plug-and-play plugin. With this particular example, I've stayed away from Saturn's wonderful modulation matrix and kept things nice and offensively simple, just to express how easy it is to get creative when a plugin has been developed so exquisitely. My aim was to simply mold things into oblivion and yet maintain a vestige of the character of the original. Whenever I use Saturn II, I start with a default slate using a single band that encompasses the entire sound. I then gauge which frequency ranges need processing and create bands to encompass each range, which can then be processed in isolation using the myriad of distortion topologies. I have created 4 distinct bands, each to isolate specific drum elements within the beat. Band 1 covers everything up to 55 Hz and uses the lead amp distortion style. Feedback frequency, which controls the delay of the feedback back into the input of the band, think of this as ringing frequency of the feedback loop. And feedback amount, which controls the negative feedback amount. Both are set to 0. Band 2 covers 55 Hz to 1.76 kHz and adopts the American tweed amp style. Feedback frequency is at 250 Hz and feedback amount is set to 11%. Tone setting has a dip of 2.5 dB for treble. Band 3 covers 1.76 kHz to 9.67 kHz and adopts the rectify style. Feedback frequency is at 250 Hz and feedback amount is set to 11%. Tone setting has a huge dip of 24 dB for mid. Band 4 covers 9.67 kHz onwards and adopts the rectify style. No feedback frequency and amount are adopted. Tone setting has a huge dip of 24 dB for mid. Each band has both mix and overall gain knobs to balance the wet-dry signal and the overall gain value for each band. And I've barely altered any of the band gain values, but have left them all at fully wet. The result is a deep and metallic texture that adds impetus and interest. In example 4, I use Boss Digital's Sasquatch 2 kick machine to add a strong attack and shorten the body of an 808 bass drum. Here is the dry version. And now the processed version. Sasquatch is promoted as a kick drum enhancement plugin, but it is far more than that, and I've used it on all manner of sounds, from percussive to basses, from keyboards to synths, and so on and on. It is deceptively easy to use, as the plugin is broken into 3 main sections: oomph, click, and direct. Oomph deals with the body of a sound, click for the attack transients, and direct for parallel mixing the original dry signal with the process signal. I started, as I always do, with processing the attack element of the sound. The click section has a very useful bandpass filter to help select the frequency range the click encompasses, and I opted for a broad range of 100 Hz to 5 kHz. This may sound quite broad and not very useful, but for a tonal kick sound like the 808, you tend to find attack transients tend to lie in ranges and not just at a specific frequency. I dialed in a sustain value of 5 milliseconds, which was perfect for a really short response. The trick is not to get hung up on values, but to use your ears to gauge the right response. Use the solo feature to hear the click in isolation, and once you're happy with the settings chosen, keep dropping in and out of solo to evaluate the overall response. Oomph is where all the action takes place, and here I decided to use a sine wave created by the built-in tone generator and specified at 440 Hz for the waveform layering. I opted for a sustain value of 220 milliseconds and shaped that with a fast attack of 0.5 milliseconds. I used a drop value of 20 milliseconds. Drop controls the speed at which the frequency of the tone generator will drop from the higher frequency to the lower frequency, and a range can be set, and in this instance I went for 30 Hz to 116 Hz. I then mixed the wet process signal with a little bit of the direct dry signal to reinforce the overall response. The 808 now exhibits a stronger attack and a tighter body, which I prefer over the more tonal and clicky original. Example 5 involves taking an acoustic drum beat and adding some life using one of the simplest yet most musical clippers, Akai Multimedia's classic clipper. First the dry version. And now the processed version. There is a distinction between clipping in the digital domain and clipping as an effect, i.e. analog. In a digital system, clipping, i.e. exceeding the headroom of the system, produces anharmonic distortion. These are non-musically generated distortion components through aliasing. In an analog system, overdriving the input stage of an A to D generates harmonic series of distortion components that, thanks to the anti-aliasing filter and the removal of distortion components above the Nyquist frequency, sounds like analog distortion. With most software clippers, hard and soft clipping options are provided to further shape the audio. Hard clipping flattens and squares off the waveform when the ceiling is exceeded and results in odd order harmonics being generated. Soft clipping is far less aggressive and introduces limiting prior to exceeding the ceiling threshold and results in a more rounded clipped waveform. Modern-day software clippers try to emulate both analog and digital clipping and offer a number of different clipping algorithms with the intention of providing harmonic distortion and gain control. They are great tools for achieving loudness and punch, be it on individual sounds or wideband in a mix context, and can be used creatively to introduce different types of harmonic distortion onto a sound or to push certain sounds through a mix. The result is a more fluid and dynamic response thanks to the harmonics being generated and sustained on the short struck notes. Pronouncing the transients of the remaining signal further highlights the generated harmonics. Clippers are weapons when it comes to mauling drum sounds. You can shape tonal kick drums, like the 808 bass drum, and push them through a mix or color them with a little fuzzy distortion which rounds them off and gives a nice, warm, gentle, distorted response. Or you can push the envelope and work magic for electronic drums by glitching them for EDM genres. With acoustic drum beats, they can add weight and a nice, dirty texture. Akai Multimedia's classic clipper does exactly what it says on the tin and does it really well. I use it for mastering, which is a testament to how well it performs. It saturates beautifully. It has a variable slope which allows for ultra soft clipping to manic hard clipping and everything in between. With this example, I'm using a hefty amount of input gain, 9.7 dBs, to drive the saturation feature. The slope feature selects between hard and soft clipping, and I've opted for a midway value. I balanced the high input gain by dropping the output gain by 9 dBs. The drum beat sounds thick, grimy, and vibrant. In the sixth example, I'm using Boss Digital's Sasquatch 1 kick machine fed into Ensoniq's 2612 retro decimator unit to add a greasy and deep ambient texture to a drum and bass sequence. Here is the dry, unprocessed version. And here is the wet, processed version. This drum beat is interesting in that there is a bass line that plays question-answer with the kick drum. The idea is not to have a distinct bass line act as a musical sequence, but rather as a sound that interchanges with the kick and supplements the entire beat. With beat sequences like this, you have to be careful when using any processor that boosts the overall low end, as this will affect both the kick drum and the interchanging bass line, and everything else that lies within this range. It therefore requires some processor planning. I find that at times like this it pays to ignore equalizers and head for tone generators. An equalizer will boost whatever lies within a selected frequency band, and that doesn't help when the aim is to work on two sets of sounds that share the same frequencies. A tone generator will produce a tone that can then be used as a layer to supplement existing sounds without the need to alter the sounds themselves. With this in mind, Boss Digital's Sasquatch 1 kick machine reigns supreme. Not only can it add a tone-generated layer, but thanks to its click section, it can be used to dirty transients. However, being a sound designer with issues, I always look for a processing edge, and adding a weighty low-end glitch response to all transients is all well and good, but it's not enough to sate the appetite of this sound designer. My mind has wandered into bit-crushing territory, but not just any bit crusher will do. A bit crusher that behaves as a musical tool is what will really alter this sequence, and Ensoniq's Retro Decimator is a perfect weapon for exactly this. Although Sasquatch 1 has been updated to 2, I find they do behave ever so slightly differently, but not enough to warrant one over the other. You have more features on 2 than 1, so it pays to stick to the newer version. Decimator is an interesting bit bludgeoning plugin and is deceptively simple to use. It provides 32 steps of 8-bit decimation, has switchable output filtering modes, Legacy, which is modeled after the Sega Genesis Model 1 amp output circuitry, and Crystal Clear, which is purely digital, and it has a parallel mix function. The first port of call is to nail the overall response and create the generated tone. The settings I've dialed in are as follows. The click section, the gain is set to -6 dBs. I set the shape all the way to the right to achieve a shorter, sharper click response. Filter 1 is set to 5 kHz with 0.7 focus. Focus controls the resonance of each filter. And filter 2 to 10 kHz with 0.7 focus. The oomph section, gain is set to minus 14 dBs. To generate the tone, I've opted for 48 Hz with a decay of 7 and a short sustain of 2. I've added 1.4 dBs of gain to the direct signal to mix it with the wet. Use this parallel feature to taste. These settings have added a weighty sub-element to the beat without altering the existing drum and bass elements. Have a listen to the beat with only Sasquatch 1. This is then fed into Retro Decimator, which has the following settings. The DAC prescaler is set to 10 and fully wet. Output filter is set to crystal clear mode. The resultant sequence is both deep and grimy, and if you listen carefully, you'll hear the generated filthy noise in the background, which lends itself beautifully to the overall ambient response. In the seventh and final example, I'm using Eventide's H949 dual harmonizer to drastically alter the kick element within a beat. The idea is to afford a huge stereo ambient kick that acts to underpin the entire beat. First, the dry version. And here is the wet, processed version. Eventide always churn out wonderful processors that lend themselves for all manner of sound design projects, and the H949 harmonizer is no exception. Built for sound designers and producers alike, the H949 takes harmonizing to a whole new level, and although the processor looks deep and complex, it is surprisingly easy to navigate, and achieving interesting and outwardly textures is a doddle. I've made sure not to color the snare or the hi-hats. The aim is to create a low-end kick that grabs the listener's attention without compromising the overall beat. To list the features of this processor would take a few pages, and I genuinely feel this is one of those plugins that you need to spend time with to get to know how it works and what it can achieve. I've selected delay for both engines and set both delay values to 0. I'm not after a pronounced delay. Rather, I'm after controlled stereo width coupled with a low frequency texture that moves. I've selected a pitch ratio of 1294 for one engine and 1665 for the other. I've set the feedback main value to 48% for the first engine and 13% for the other. The feedback controls route a portion of the output signal back to the input. You can create some interesting movement using only these two parameters. I have left all other values in feedback at default. I've set both stereo feedback and stereo link to mono. Stereo width is at 50%. Any more and you will hear the kick unnaturally pan wide to the brink of stereo collapse. Parallel mix is set to 28% and I have maxed the main level. The result is a lovely deep low-end kick element that hovers below and around the main snare and hi-hat sequence. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. This has been Eddie Bazil for Sound on Sound.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Oh, and just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcast website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.